It would be hard to argue that Assassin's Creed Unity's launch wasn't one hell of a train wreck. A game that was not only riddled with bugs, but downright unplayable on release. It frequently soft-locked, mission markers failed to load, the frame rate was single digits at times, and this is all before even considering this non-Euclidean nightmare. It was, for want of a better word, a disaster. Perhaps more heartbreaking still, apart from this one unavoidable caveat, I would happily argue that Unity is one of the better games of the current gen, and certainly one of my personal favourites. This is a bold claim to immediately follow words like disaster and train wreck, I know, but even as it pains me, I want to sell Unity as a game that deserves more praise than it gets. Why am I willing to go to bat for a game with so many problems? One word: promise. Underneath all the detritus and bad business decisions, Unity is a game that shows that the series isn't a dead end, that it still has the potential to live up to that unfulfilled promise of the first game. The original Assassin's Creed, which graced our shores nearly a decade ago, was sold on this idea of being a different take on the stealth genre, a game about hiding in plain sight, blending in with the crowd, and belting across rooftops to shank some poor sod with all the subtlety of Rip Taylor. And in fairness to that original game, it did all of these things pretty well, but it also felt incomplete, like it was the precursor to something greater. Subsequent games in the franchise capitalized on this core design, elaborating in exciting and inventive ways, whether that's broing out with Leonardo da Vinci, commanding your own army of assassins, taking to the high seas of the Caribbean, or going on a nice horse ride with Paul Revere. Okay, maybe not that exciting, but with every new game, good and bad, the promise of the first still felt unfulfilled. As good as these games got at kitting out their protagonists with all manner of tools, adding new features and streamlining processes, there were limits to what could be achieved with hardware at the time. Admittedly, it wasn't just a tech problem. The overarching design ethos seems to have this fractured identity. An open-world game with largely linear tasks, offering the player a wealth of choice when it comes to which instructions they would have to follow to the T. The main issue with this is that the series is built with emulation rather than simulation in mind. It's sort of a curated diorama in which things only react in specific ways, limiting the player to a finite number of meaningful experiences. And because of hardware limitations, these games played out more like a climbing apparatus than a sandbox.
This is it. You have got the right place.
There's nothing inherently wrong with this. Rockstar's flagship series Grand Theft Auto is built around carefully curated player experience, and those games are highly regarded. But especially compared to similar games from that era, titles like Dishonored, Deus Ex Human Revolution, and even Hitman Absolution, yes, the bad Hitman game, this lack of simulation always felt like a black mark for Assassin's Creed as a franchise, holding it back from fostering player immersion in a world of assassination. So a new console generation comes along, and with it comes a potentially expanded vision for the next big thing. The cross-gen offering, Black Flag, was widely hailed as a return to form after 3's disappointing direction. Players loved the varied gameplay that combined assassinations with high-seas piracy, and, more importantly, that it vastly toned down the sci-fi elements of the game's narrative. Following a game praised for its ship combat with one that's entirely landlocked was a bold move, but it was clear that the developers of Unity had grand ambitions. Starting with its setting. I imagine that the French Revolution has been a highly sought-after era for Ubisoft since the beginning. One of Assassin's Creed's core themes is the idea of personal grievances acted out against the backdrop of history-defining conflict. Bringing us to one of the most violent, turbulent eras in French history was a no-brainer, but it was also something that had to be done right. This was an era of bigger buildings, imposing crowds, and a sense of world-changing schism in the air. These are all things required of the latest entry. Things I believe Unity successfully pulled out of the bag. Unity's Revolution-era Paris is a beautiful relic scarred by human acts. It's a living, breathing behemoth of stone, steel, cloth, blood and dirt. An organism simultaneously in its death throes and born anew. A digital rendition of an entity so vibrant, so complex, is an immeasurable challenge, but the wizards at Ubisoft Montreal brought the city to life, in part thanks to excellent art direction. Taking a turn down any street and you'll find murals, architecture, banners and posters, the ground littered with historical iconography. And the extra oomph of a new platform allowed for a denser NPC population, making the game feel busy and the world feel lived in. This is all bolstered by the great sense of scale that the game has. With remarkable fluidity, you can dive from the top of Paris's tallest structure to ground level, then dash through archways, windows and doors into smaller, enclosed spaces still rich with detail. There are some more subtle touches that aid a sense of vulnerability in the wider world, like the way Arnaud Dorian moves when navigating the city, those flailing limbs when he jumps just a little too far, and one particular animation used when performing a leap of faith that always tricks me into thinking I've made a mistake. Unity's map is big, but also densely packed to the point that regardless of whether you are pottering around at ground level or engaging in a bit of parkour across the rooftops, there's a creeping claustrophobia just hiding in the peripheries. This is a world that is imposing, but full of opportunities. It's easier to hide in plain sight, the environment rife with ways to evade or attack your prey, and your Batman-esque loadout gives you more ways to interact with the environment, albeit in still quite limited ways. Mission variety is better than in previous installments, although it's still far from the incredible sandboxes that the series would greatly benefit from. There's a greater range of approaches to objectives through both set design and a new equipment system that allows players to customize their playstyle. Certain outfits bolster stealth, while others transform you into a walking tank. And different bits of gear impact ammunition capacity too, so you may want to sacrifice health for more phantom blades or vice versa.
What's our plan?
Our plan? You're not an apprentice anymore, boy. So study your surroundings. Devise your own plan.
Unity's bigger missions also offer multiple approaches to gaining entry to the area and taking out the target. There are optimal strategies, helpfully labelled opportunities, but you're never punished for deviation in the way that you were in some of the previous games. Not all missions have the same structure either, and this is exemplified best by my favourite side quest, investigations. Small murder mystery vignettes that require more than just ticking boxes. The player is required to conduct an analogue examination of evidence to come to a conclusion about who the guilty party are. They're not the most cryptic puzzles in the world, and spoiler alert, there's no penalty for false conclusions, but because you have to accuse someone first before you find out if you were right, there's this great illusion of pressure. The Nostradamus enigmas take this one step further, offering a riddle that challenges not only your ability to decipher, but your knowledge of the city you're inhabiting and its history. There are no shortcuts to success, and for me this is where the game really shines. It's a nice change of pace for a series infamous for its entirely aggressive approach to world interaction, and it's a blueprint I'd like to see rub off on more areas of any future titles. Perhaps taking the Morrowind approach to quest design, or at least giving the player more room to figure things out for themselves. I may be alone in this, but I really love the online co-op too. Specially curated missions for up to 4 eager assassins that provide a fun challenge and expand the scope of the core gameplay mechanics. Again, there are optimal strategies, but no right way to complete objectives. And it's a great laugh joining forces with other players and seeing how they approach the same tasks, and with what level of competence. Unity has evolved in positive ways, but it is far from perfect, even ignoring the technical issues. While the scope has increased, the game still suffers from open world bloat. For every worthy mission or diversion there are 10 MacGuffins to collect, continuing that tiresome trend of filling empty space for the sake of adding another box to the checklist. You've all seen that bloody map, haven't you? While navigating the environments is mostly better, the rigidity of that climbing system sometimes still falls apart. Just take a look at this bullshit. As I mentioned before, for all the quality of life improvements, Unity remains rigidly stuck in a design blueprint that is more emulation than simulation, which leaves little wiggle room for creative problem solving. But this is exacerbated by the clumsiness of its controls, which made me favour certain playstyles over others just to avoid wrestling with some of the game's systems. This may just be my poor hand-eye coordination though, as there is ample evidence, especially from Stealth Gamer BR, which shows how successful deft hands can be with the tools available. For all its sins, Unity remains a firm favourite of mine, a game I've returned to out of longing to be in that world. It's not going to be for everyone, that tired formula is there in droves, and while I have a strange fondness for it, I am fully aware that I'm probably dying on this hill alone. I don't even play it that much. I just like having a bit of a trot around Revolution-era Paris from time to time. And it's not going to hold up against other stealth games, or even other open worlds, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it can't hold a candle to the industry greats. And for me, even though it's up against stiff competition, there is something inexplicable about the way Unity works that I genuinely love. The story is fine, as is the gameplay. Both are flawed but enjoyable. But the setting? That's the money shot. Masterfully coupling historical accounts with creative deconstructions of folklore, Unity's Paris feels alive. The air is thick with the noise of humanity. Every burst of laughter, every cry of anguish, the garishly decadent mansions and muddy, disease-ridden slums all tell tall tales. As charming and forgettable as its protagonist is, the city is the star of the show, and a testament to why ambition should always be sought. But, alas, we have to return to that one unavoidable caveat. Because for all its good graces and notable achievements, Unity is still a game that launched in a completely unacceptable state, and remained problematic for months after launch. It was clear from a very early stage that these problems were the product of years of watertight release schedules coming to a violent and unexpected stop as the developers wrestled with increasingly complex new hardware. Unity had to be bigger, it had to look better, and it had to be released on time, but to achieve this, something had to drop off. It took 3 sizable patches, but months later most of the big problems had been resolved. There are still frame rate issues and the collision detection is still a bit wonky, but having played the game both unpatched and patched, I can honestly say that the jump in quality is staggering. It leads me to believe that if Unity had been given another 6 months, we wouldn't be sat here talking about this today. It's a good thing that the game was eventually bandaged up to a suitable degree. No game studio wants to release an inferior product, but, and here's the crux of the issue, this is of no use to players with no internet access. One thing that often gets forgotten when it comes to discourse about online accessibility is that it's not a universal right. Having broadband is costly, and in rural areas and cases like the overseas deployment of the armed forces, it's not even an option. Where internet access is available, it still might not be fast enough to cope with the 6 GB patch the game essentially needs to be playable. Even if we disregard this issue, a question arises about what kind of precedent is being set for the future of the industry. Is it right to focus on performance issues at the expense of a game's more positive qualities, essentially dooming its legacy? Short answer, yes, absolutely. We are on the cusp of a worrying trend in gaming, moving slowly but surely from release now, patch later mentality towards early access titles offering infinite potential with zero security, where a game could potentially release in what many would consider an unfinished state, with little penalty for its abandonment. I'm not going to stand here and argue that developers and publishers inherently can't be trusted. After all, a shitty reputation is bad for business, and early access at its core is a fundamentally good thing that has allowed countless talent to blossom in ways that weren't probably possible before. But, as with all other next big things, there will be those who take the piss. Art is an entity whose meaning shifts from eye to eye, but games as an interactive medium are unique in that their canvas is impacted by flaws in a much greater way. A film is judged by this same metric, however those flaws are of the content of the media, not its method of distribution. When you add interactivity into the fray, things get a lot more complicated. But even still, a game that is almost unplayable at launch, or at best beset with glaring flaws, absolutely must be judged for these elements. Judged for what the product offers out of the box, not for a hypothetical future state. Because if we want this medium to have value, it must have that value for every audience. Holding games to a basic minimum standard of quality is a fundamentally pragmatic path to take. Thankfully, the backlash to Unity's launch provoked a positive response from Ubisoft, who seem to have understood that the same mistake cannot happen again. Syndicate launched the year after in a much better state, although it was far from perfect, and the 1-year delay to the newly announced Assassin's Creed Origins was welcome news. As that old, slightly untrue idiom goes, a delayed game is eventually good. A bad game is bad forever. Unity's technical issues are a tragedy that masks an otherwise excellent game, but those issues are a valid part of the way we critically examine it. It's a work of art held back by limitations of time and tech, where the publisher chose ambition over stability in an environment where the option for both wasn't available. But still, it seems unhelpful to praise ambition over execution, and at the end of the day, a player's willingness to forgive issues like these are entirely at their discretion. I could, but that doesn't mean I'm right to have done so. So here's to you, Ubisoft. Here's to your artists and writers, to your coders and quality assurers, to your historians. You made a great game. It's just a shame about the performance issues.